So, thank you very much. You have the slides? That's all right. Okay, so you've heard this mentioned a few times during the day so far from Patrick and others, but what I want to talk about is the example of two studies that GSK has been leading in Salford. I'll come on to Salford in a little bit. I only discovered where it was a while ago, when even I've lived in the UK for a long time. But these are about studies how we demonstrate effectiveness in everyday clinical practice. So it's particularly thinking about how do you go from the clinical trials which are looking at the efficacy, as Rob sort of laid out initially this morning, and thinking about how do you actually answer a real question about how the drug actually works in clinical situations in which it will ultimately be used. And I think particularly for these studies where it would have been impossible to do a clinical trial to give you the same evidence to answer this question in a very controlled way. So, just to start off with, what do we actually need to be able to do? So, we think about clinical trials, and particularly early on in the phase 2, early phase 3 part of a process, where we look within particular populations, we prescribe a level of control within that trial, looking at the patients, measuring them on a relatively frequent basis. Medicine is provided to them as part of that clinical trial, and we're focusing on the clinical efficacy. Actually, when you look towards the real-world evidence and towards what is happening within usual care, you're really interested in how does the medicine work in a usual care clinical setting. So the population is relatively broad, the people who would normally be treated. It is just normal care, so we try not to put anything else on top of those patients. You don't schedule visits, you don't have the patients doing things which they wouldn't normally do, you let drugs be prescribed in their usual way, and you focus on the endpoints which matter towards patients. And really, as we go through the talk for the next sort of 10 or so minutes, I really want to pull out some of those areas where actually we have to really challenge how we do some of these studies and really had to build different approaches to thinking about clinical trials to really be able to answer this particular question. So, for those of you who've never been to Salford, which I'm guessing is possibly the majority of this audience, Salford is a little town, suburb of Greater Manchester in England. And what the lung studies were the world's first effectiveness randomized trials. They initiated on what at the time was a pre-authorization medicine. So there's an investigational medical product in a pre-authorized setting to look at what the safety and effectiveness of the medication was as a maintenance therapy for COPD and asthma in a general practice setting in the UK. So you're really trying to get at how does the drug work in routine care in the UK to get towards relevant information for clinicians, the healthcare system, payers and patients. So it really looked at real-time data collection. It was focused on effectiveness, and I'll show as we look at the design, it's a very broad population, it's open label, it's set in routine care, and it utilises electronic data where it can utilise it. And I think there's a good contrast between the discussion we had this morning on what is possible and capable in the US today, and why the UK gives you a very different perspective and view on that because of some of the things that are possible in the UK. So, there are two studies within this. I said there's one in COPD, there's one in asthma. The design is broadly similar between both, with some minor differences between the two settings. So we wanted to ask the question of how effective is initiating treatment compared to continuing treatment with usual care. And because this was a pre-authorization and this involves some of the infrastructure we essentially needed, we had to have reporting of safety as a randomized and by actual treatment and within the usual frameworks for safety reporting of an interventional clinical study. However, when you start to look at how we actually recruited patients in and what they were, these were just minimally inclusive. So they were patients who were seen by GP, so primary care physicians in the UK. They were over 40. The GP said they had a diagnosis of COPD. So we didn't measure them, we didn't do any lung function on them, it was purely a primary care-led diagnosis. So people who would now normally be treated by GPs in the future. They were on an ICS and or LABA-LAMA for treatment. They had had a COPD exacerbation in the previous 3 years, so they probably had COPD. It helps confirm the diagnosis, and they consented to take part. It was a relatively simple consent. And then in how we executed the study, there was only 2 visits. So they started and they stopped. And everything else in between was done by routine clinical care. So they had a routine review, they were instructed how to use the particular device. And the reason for this particular trial and the reason for this focus is this was moving towards a device which would give medication once a day, as opposed to their current usual care, which would be twice a day. There's no obvious way anyone could come up with of how you could do that in a traditional approach of a clinical trial. This is the only way you can answer this question, because you don't have to put placebos or dummies or other things in there to try to replicate the 2 arms. It was open label. They were followed essentially for 12 months. If they never came in for a regular routine visit with a GP, there was a phone call that went out to them to check they were alive, still within the area, still within the systems. But ultimately, nothing actually happened to them, and we followed them again at the end of 12 months at an end of study visit. So on to collecting the data. So the interesting piece is everyone sort of, when I hear talk about it, says, well, EHRs are really helpful because they get you everything. Well, we had a single EHR in Salford. There was one system, but it also required 15 data feeds for each individual to get all of the information from all of the different pieces of the systems, that we made sure we captured everything about that particular patient. So we needed to understand, so the primary data fed from the local GP, primary care physicians, and from the integrated system within the main hospital. But we also needed to know if they touched out of hours care. So if they'd had a reason to see somebody overnight, did they actually see that? Where did that visit get recorded? We needed data coming in from the research nurses if they happened to be seeing. We needed it from other primary care physicians just in case they were out of area and seen out of area. Again, if they had emergency admissions in other hospitals, we needed that data. And we wanted data from the pharmacies, because one of the ways that we delivered the study was we allowed the medication to be picked up in all of the local pharmacies in the local area. So it was as if you were taking part in collecting your medication if it was licensed. So we needed feeds from all of those pharmacies to know exactly when people had been in, when they collected the medication, and when it came back, when they picked it up. So all of those complicated bits of data need to flow together to allow you to be able to look at this sort of system. Part of it is for the study team to look at the safety components and to do the regulatory reporting on safety events. And the rest all flowed through a sort of central third party in terms of integrating the data together and essentially pulling, at the end of the study data sets. And there were other components to this, so not all the data is in the clinical report is in the EHR system. So there's some data we collect through clinical report form, some validation of things. There's some spirometry data which comes from a different provider. Even though we're not requiring it, it's measured somewhere else and flows back in. There's questionnaires, etc. So there's a lot of complexity about how you get all the data together. But ultimately, the data isn't collected by CRF. It's not investigator collected. It is what's in the systems. And we work, I think as this morning's discussion went, we work with the back-end computational piece and not the front-end trying to make the data there. We really focus on how can you use the data that's collected. So just to give an idea of the sort of scale, and I think this speaks to how we think about these types of studies in the future. Within COPD, we had 2,800 patients. Within asthma, we recruited 4,200 patients. So we followed these people now for a year. It required us getting 130 pharmacies in the area involved into drug distribution. So if you're in the pre-authorization setting, that's a very different scenario to post-authorization. You need to have a controlled supply chain to get to the pharmacies to allow the distribution. The data alone, the underlying core data, there's somewhere in excess of 235 million rows of data. That flows down relatively quickly to the few bits that you actually want, but you need all of that data to be able to piece it together algorithmically into the exact events that are of interest, and to know that you can, exactly as we talked through this morning, you can cross-match between different systems to see if the events are actually there. It took around 80 GP practices to recruit. There was an electronic health, one single health record system that we were working with within the Salford area. And essentially, we trained somewhere around 3,000 individuals on GCP and on the ability to deliver a clinical trial in order to make this study a reality. So there is certainly questions of how this scales and whether we've got the right processes outside of the company in place. Is the regulatory piece is all there. But it is a mammoth achievement to get to the point of where we are today with this study. And just to show the sort of completion of the story, we've actually now reported out the COPD arm of the trial, the COPD trial. The asthma trial will complete towards the end of this year and report into next year. So what we were able to show in this study is in a population which have minimal intervention, but there is a randomization component, that you see about an 8.4% reduction in moderate severe exacerbations compared to usual care. We can look at the safety, and the safety, as I say, was monitored on a daily basis from these data feeds. But you can look at the sort of adverse events and the serious adverse events. They were very similar between both groups. And actually, this gives you some real information that you can then use to have meaningful conversations about benefits to the patients, to understand how this fits within the healthcare system, and to understand how the medicine is going to be used in clinical practice based on what was seen in this particular study. So just to sort of conclude, it really was the very first time this type of study, particularly the pre-authorization component, was ever done. It has so far now generated important information which helps clinicians, decision makers, patients make better decisions based on evidence that is in usual practice. One of the things that has been really critical to the success of this is this wasn't a GSK did it alone. This was a lot of partnership in the northwest area of the UK. There was a really strong partnership with the healthcare system there. There was a strong partnership between the GPs and the pharmacists involved. And really, if that hadn't been there, I don't think this study would have been as easy to do or even possible to do as what it was. I think what we've learned a lot about is the potential of electronic health records. They've generated a lot of data that's come into this study, and they've allowed us to do this study very differently to how we would have done it otherwise. But there are still challenges in that. So we scaled from one hospital in Manchester to 2 hospitals in Manchester. The data in those 2 systems was very, very different. We had to build a different process in the second hospital because they didn't record everything that the first hospital did. Every time we thought we'd made the breakthrough, there was another challenge which you then have to think about. And I think to the point that a lot of people kind of brought up this morning, the electronic health record might not contain all of the things that we want. And I think the open question is, do we try to enforce it to keep all of the information that we want? Or do we use what's possible in there and build around that with simple data collection tools to collect the extra information, potentially direct from patients or from physicians or through devices? And ultimately, going back, I think, to where Patrick started his comments this morning, this type of study answers a particular question, and it's really the question that's important. You know, if you focus on why this particular study or these particular studies were designed and delivered in the way they were, is because we had a question about this medicine that we weren't able to answer in a different way. So what we might do in the future is going to be driven by what the questions are. And thinking about what those questions are tell us the right ways to go about doing it, and whether it's a EHR-enabled usual care study or something else will ultimately be a relevance to the questions that the medicines need to answer. Thank you.